I talked about this on my podcast the other day. Is influence inherently bad? What's different about me and a cult leader? I'm kind of influencing people, right? In my video called How to Deprogram a Religious Extremist, I use advanced psychological techniques to change somebody's mind on something. Isn't that what Jehovah's Witnesses do? We're going to talk about how to ethically influence people. Let's get into it. So here's the question. Is it unethical to influence somebody? By teaching you guys how to deprogram a religious extremist, aren't I giving you the tools to do exactly what cults do? The short answer to that is yes, but it isn't that simple. We're influenced by things all the time. Your friend might influence you to go to Red Lobster instead of Outback Steakhouse. Why isn't that unethical, but Jehovah's Witnesses influencing you is unethical? Stephen Hassan talks about this in one of his books. I know I've been talking about him a lot lately, but I want to be sure I give credit where credit's due. He put a lot of work into this subject. He leads the field. If we want to understand how cults work, our best bet is to start with him. Influence can be placed on a spectrum between healthy or constructive and unhealthy and destructive. How do we tell what's ethical? How do we know what's healthy and constructive? It's really going to depend on who's doing the influencing. It can come from individuals, from leaders, or from organizations. We need to realize that cults have very specific goals. Based on the Bite model, cults are commonly going to have a set of shared beliefs. They'll commonly try to shield members from criticism, divide things into black and white thinking, teach thought-stopping techniques, all that stuff. And that stuff adds up to a shared identity with other people, beyond a sense of unity. You become clones of each other, feeding off of each other's shared experiences. The cult wants to replace your authentic identity with their own. I've been saying for years that Jehovah's Witnesses wear this mask 24/7. On an individual level, when they're trying to influence you, they'll also use conditional love instead of unconditional love. That plays into this system of rewards and punishments. A lot of the time, you'll hear them say things like, well, everybody has a line where they'll start shunning other people. If your son turned out to be a murderer, then you'd shun him too. The problem with that rationalization is the fact that the cult decides the basis on which the person should shun family members, based on their own doctrine instead of basing it on the person's conscience. Influence shouldn't come in the form of solemnity, fear, and guilt. It should come in the form of creativity and humor. That encourages the person to build and maintain their own identity. People who are influencing others in a destructive or an unhealthy way will encourage dependency and obedience instead of free will or critical thinking. With me specifically, when I try to deprogram people, for lack of a better term, my goal is to wipe away the doctrine and beliefs and dependency and restore their authentic self. Get rid of the mask. Try to break them out of this one-track mind that they've been given. It's genuinely hard to do, but I'll talk about it in a few minutes so you guys can see what I mean. Now, the signs for leaders using destructive or unhealthy influence is a little different than individuals. Some signs a leader might be using destructive or unhealthy influence include narcissistic or psychopathic behavior, elitist or grandiose instead of being realistic and recognizing their own limits. If they're power hungry instead of trying to empower people around them, if they're secretive or deceptive instead of trustworthy, or if they claim absolute authority instead of showing accountability, they could very well be using unhealthy or destructive influence. Do they deflect or ban criticism? Do they claim that they have special, unique information that nobody else has access to? Do they claim they're the only source of that information? When they do something wrong, like, for example, ban blood transfusions, and then later find out that it's killing thousands of people, and that it isn't what the Bible meant in the first place, do they dig in and claim that God gave them the message personally, or do they apologize and reverse their position? When somebody comes in and says, that doesn't sound right to me, about anything at all, do they hear them out? Do they not care in the first place? Or do they care so much that everybody involved is completely unified that they'll ban friends and family from talking to somebody the moment they think there might be disagreement or dissent? If that's the route they take, they're probably influencing people in a negative, unhealthy, destructive way. So how do you tell if you're being influenced in a destructive or an unhealthy way on an organizational level? You might be in a destructive or an unhealthy organization if it has an authoritarian structure without checks and balances. If it's deceptive deceptive or manipulative instead of getting informed consent. If it seems like it wants to clone people's personalities instead of encouraging individuality and diversity. If it has an ends justify the means mentality instead of means create the end. You see this one a lot with Scientology. The whole fair game policy they have, where they ruin people's lives at any cost if it's in service of the organization. Jehovah's Witnesses have something similar too, called theocratic warfare, but it's a little bit different because Jehovah's Witnesses are complete pacifists, so you won't see them doing anything violent usually. They'll lie, but they won't set out to ruin somebody's life in the name of the organization like a Scientologist might. If the organization is trying to preserve its own power instead of encouraging member growth, then it's probably influencing people in an unhealthy way. If they tell you there's no legitimate reason to leave, as opposed to members being completely free to leave, then it's probably destructive. A lot of the time you'll hear Jehovah's Witnesses say, I can leave anytime I want. I'm not being held against my will. But it isn't really about being held against your will. It's about them being influenced to the point where they don't want to leave in the first place. The cult identity takes over and they can't imagine life outside the group. Before you know it, everybody with whom they associate is a member. They cut off contact with anybody on the outside. So even if they did decide they wanted to leave, their entire lives are built up around this organization, so they have no support structure to lean on when they finally do it. I've mentioned this, but I've been in a few clubs before. I never felt pressured to remain a member. When it was time for me to leave, I just left the group. No big deal. Didn't even have to say bye to anybody if I didn't want to, because all those people knew me and they were willing to continue talking to me after I left. That's the difference between destructive influence and constructive or healthy influence. Okay, now that we know how people are influenced and we know the difference between healthy and unhealthy influence, let's talk about what I do to influence people. I've talked about this before in my How to Deprogram a Religious Extremist video. It's all about how you approach the conversation. If you come at it in an accusing way, or if you let on that you're trying to deprogram them, then they're gonna lock into their position and you'll never break them out of it. Come at it like you're curious but skeptical, like you're trying to get more information about the group. Possibly interested, but you feel like you're on the fence and you want to get some questions answered first. If they already know you're kind of dead set against it, if they already know you don't really believe it at all, it should still work, but you're gonna have to approach it from that angle anyways. Come at the conversation like you're skeptical but curious. And here's the key. You have to be respectful. You're gonna need to build a trust relationship with them before you can really make any progress. Make them understand that you aren't there to judge them or their way of life or any of that. You genuinely want to know about the group. If they make a good point, you should acknowledge that point and accept it. If they say something like, there's so much racism and hate in the world, in the group we focus on that and try to eliminate it. You can help build the trust relationship by telling them that that's an honest and good goal, and you'd like to see other groups doing the same thing. Accepting a concession from them means that they're more willing to accept one from you. People mirror each other in conversations. If you're on the defensive, if you're arguing and saying, no, you're wrong, let me tell you the truth about this or that, then they're going to be on the defensive too. You need to be as calm, rational, kind, and skeptical as you want them to be. And never, never, never come with facts. This isn't about facts. They'll always have an explanation for why the facts are wrong, and it'll lock them into their position even deeper. They'll just start parroting the cult propaganda. If they come at you with something like, the earth was created 3,000 years ago by Wayne and Mapenku, you don't want to challenge them with something like, no it wasn't, we have trees that are older than that. Try saying something like, how do we know this? How can we be sure of it? Notice how I use the words we and this instead of how do you know that? It's a far less aggressive way of wording it. Using we instead of you makes people feel like you're in it together. You're both trying to get to the bottom of it. It makes it easier for them to mirror your skeptical perspective on things. And it doesn't sound sarcastic. It's less likely to lead them to believe that you're completely closed off to the possibility that they're right. When they come back at you with, well, the leader told us, and he knows all about it. He's even met with Wayne and Mapenku, or some other completely crazy claim like that. Give them a hypothetical. Remember, we aren't challenging claims. We aren't offering facts. We're just asking non-confrontational questions and seeing if we can get them to think critically. That's what this is all about. Maybe try saying, I'm not saying this isn't true. It very well could be, but let me ask you this. What if we could verify today that it wasn't true? Would you still believe this? Would you still trust the leader? At this point, you can usually expect them to say, well, no, I'd still believe it. That's getting them to realize that they aren't really thinking critically about things. You want to move them in the right direction. Ask them, if it isn't about what the leader says, then what is it? Ultimately, when you ask them for their best examples and then ask them if those examples didn't exist, would they still believe it enough times, they'll eventually default to faith. It just comes down to belief. That's the bottom line. And in fact, that's the bottom line with every belief. You either have evidence for it or you don't. Faith and evidence are mutually exclusive. If you have evidence, then you don't need faith. If you have faith, then you don't think you need evidence. At this point, they've admitted that it's all about faith and belief. Now you can ask them how you can tell the difference between who's right, a Muslim with their faith and belief, or them. If you stayed calm and rational and kind through the whole thing, then hopefully you can manage to keep them out of defense mode, and their critical thinking processes will kick into gear. Just be sure you don't make it about denominations, because that'll bring up the cult reaction. Lots of Jehovah's Witnesses are programmed with responses to explain why they're more correct than Catholics or Baptists or Methodists. Make it about a completely different religion. Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, something like that. It doesn't have to be about religion either. You could ask them about any faith-based belief. Just try to steer clear of anything for which they're likely to have a pre-programmed cult response. If you can manage it, sometimes it's best to go at them on a few different occasions. It isn't easy to change somebody's mind in a day. It may be best to let them sit on it and think about what you said, then give it another try. I talk about this in my other video, How to Deprogram a Religious Extremist, Part 1. This isn't actually in Stephen Hassan's book. This is from something called A Manual for Creating Atheists. It's a modified version of cognitive behavioral therapy called street epistemology. There are some YouTube channels out there with people who sit on the street and invite people to do it with them. They sit at a table or they stand there and do a 15-minute interview with them. Some of the best channels that do this are Truth Wanted, part of the ACA, with Objectively Dan as the host, Anthony Magnabosco, and one of my personal favorites, Cordial Curiosity. I'll put links to their videos down below if you guys want to see the method in action. It's pretty cool to watch, actually. And Anthony Magnabosco has been doing it for years and years. It's kind of been on the forefront of discussion. He has conversations on his channel with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Catholics, all kinds of people. It's really fascinating. You should definitely check it out. So let's revisit the original question. Am I no better than a cult leader? Do I influence people in the same way? Am I manipulative? I am using advanced psychological techniques to influence people, that's true, but the entire method is based around improving critical thinking skills. It's designed to restore the person's authentic self and shake off that cult doctrine. Once they start seeing the cult for what it is, questionable at best, complete BS at worst, they start to see how they've been used. That's really the problem when it comes down to it. As I said before, everybody is influenced every day. It isn't about being influenced. I was influenced by somebody to get Taco Bell in the middle of making this video instead of finishing the damn thing. It's how you're taken advantage of. It's how you're used to benefit the group or the leader or the organization without your true informed consent. When people come out of an oppressive religion, they see that. They realize what happened to them, and they're pissed. I know, because it happened to me. It happens to almost everybody coming out of a cult. But maybe we can channel some of that anger into something productive, getting other people out of oppressive organizations. Anyways, that's all I've got for you guys. Don't forget to follow me on Patreon. If you like the work I do, even $1 a month goes an insanely long way. I think I'd prefer 50 people giving $1 a month instead of one person giving $50 a month, because it's more stable, it's more reliable. So like I said, anything you can do is greatly appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and all social media. And check out my podcast where I read extremist literature and talk about things like this. That's where I got the idea for this video in the first place, actually. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.